Welcome back. This is World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Senior officials of the U.S. Department of Commerce are expected to visit China this week, according to some media reports, which is considered a prelude of U.S. Commerce Secretary's potential trip later. The group is set to discuss bilateral trade and commercial opportunities. The U.S. Federal Reserve recently raised its interest rates by another quarter to just below 5% to fight the high inflation. On the relationship between China and the United States, earlier, my interview with Stephen Roach specifically mentioned about the importance of trust. Stephen Roach is a senior fellow of the Yale University. He talked to me earlier about the necessity of trust and how to maintain the trust between China and the United States. Professor Roach, what a pleasure to see you in person.
It's been a long time.
The world has changed since 3 years ago or 4 years ago, last time we met.
That's correct.
One of the latest people are looking at is the banking crisis or the possible banking crisis, starting from SVB to some of the local banks in the U.S. and later Credit Suisse. What do you see might be the scale of this crisis?
We never know. We always hope that it'll be limited, but our experience with crises in the past, and there have been 3 major crises since in the last 25 years. The Asian financial crisis, the dot-com crisis, the global financial crisis, and now we're seeing some impacts of a new crisis. Each one of the previous 3 we always thought would be limited, and yet every single one of them have been broad. There's been a lot of contagion across borders, across products, across institutions. So while we're hopeful this one is limited, the experience that we've been through over the last 25 years suggests that that may be wishful thinking. This crisis is an outgrowth of over 15 years of extraordinarily easy monetary policy. Very low interest rates, reinforced and justified by low inflation. Inflation's higher today across the world, with China being a notable exception so far. We don't know yet. But as inflation has come back, monetary policy has had to return to normal, and that's required sharp increases in interest rates that many financial institutions like Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank, First Republic Bank, maybe Credit Suisse in Switzerland, were unprepared for. There are many, many more out there that I think similarly are unprepared for. But there's an old saying in the United States, we don't know who's been swimming naked until the tide goes out. And the tide is going out, and the risk is there will be more to come.
A lot of debate about the role of the Fed, of course. Of course, the latest has been a very slight move of 0.25% a quarter. It's already quite mild, and yet many also wonder higher interest rate, would that create more uncertainties to come?
Well, we've all been very much prepared by the Fed for further increases in interest rates because their primary focus is on inflation control, and inflation is still too high. It's 6% in the United States. Their target is 2%. They've been slow initially to recognize the significance of the inflation problem in the United States. They have moved very aggressively once they recognized that the post-COVID inflation in the United States was not transitory as they initially expected. And these sharp moves to go from 0 to 5 in less than 12 months has really taken many institutions by surprise, and many investors by surprise as well. But the Fed has more work to do. The aspect of their performance that I personally find most disturbing is more on their role as supervisors of banks. They do an annual stress test that they publish the results of every February, and in the stress test, they had it gave no advance warning of the problems that were to shortly emerge in Silicon Valley Bank and other U.S. institutions, and that's, I think, a mistake on their part. The stress test should have been more effectively designed to capture these risks.
On the other hand, the movement of the Fed certainly also have tremendous impact on the U.S. dollar and therefore on the other economies as well, Professor. And now there is a lot of uncertainties in the other economies too. So once again, the U.S. has a very strong role in terms of where dollar is. And as a result of that, a very strong role in the world economy. Yeah. But where is the responsibility of the U.S. economy vis-a-vis the responsibility for the economies everywhere in the world? Even though U.S. is one of those driving forces, but not the only one. So it's a very interesting question now.
I think what we've learned in the last few decades is that while the Federal Reserve is certainly mindful of risks that may bear elsewhere on the world, that the best monetary policy for the United States is to focus on its objectives of the domestic economy. And I think that's true of China, it's true of Europe, it's true of Japan. And while we're sensitive to the possibility that these risks could spread overseas, if we control domestic inflation at home, and the Federal Reserve has not done the best job in doing that since the outbreak of COVID, then the impacts on the rest of the world will be manageable for economies in Asia, for economies in Europe, and for the Chinese economy as well.
Meanwhile, the financial world has been very much interconnected with one another when we talk about cross borders. That's how it works. But of course, geopolitics have also tremendous impact on it recently, given the Russian-Ukraine conflict. So how do you see the trust that economies could have with one another in terms of financial cooperation?
Trust is a big word, and there's really a huge trust deficit right now that I worry about a lot between the United States and China. And so I will show you this book that I've just written about the conflict between the U.S. and China, which I'm worried about a lot. I think the conflict is an outgrowth of a lot of false impressions or false narratives that both nations, the United States and China, have with respect to one another, and we need to recognize where those false narratives come from and what can be done to address it. I've written a 430-page book about just that. But I end the book with some recommendations of what must be done to arrest the conflict. And the first and foremost objective is to rebuild trust between the United States and China. That's very hard to do, very hard to do.
How is the key?
I lay out an agenda of up to 10 specific things that can be done, starting with small steps, easy steps, like reopening closed consulates in Chengdu, in Houston, Texas, restarting very important student foreign exchange programs, relaxing visa requirements between the traveling between the two countries, and then moving up higher in terms of the agenda, tougher to do but important to do, relaxing restraints on non-governmental organizations, NGOs, and then the tougher ones, climate, global health, cybersecurity protocols. If we can begin to make little steps in those areas, then we can tackle some of the bigger issues that can resolve conflict in the United States and China.
What is preventing us from making the baby steps as you suggested?
political courage. With leadership, strong leadership requires the ability to let go of grievances that I think, and I argue in this book, are based on, mainly on exaggerated false impressions that are evident in both sides. And so it's going to take a strong and courageous leadership, either in one nation, the U.S., or China, or hopefully both.
So how do you see, Professor, at this point, can we take advantage, quote unquote, of this global crisis, for example, on climate, and be able to bring China and the U.S. closer, at least the baby steps that you just mentioned?
Well, climate's a big issue, and taking baby steps doesn't cut it for dealing with the severe problems of global warming. We have to take big steps. We have to collaborate and work together. We've made slight progress on climate, but we need to do a lot more. This is a natural opportunity for two superpowers to come together and save the planet. And we, shame on us if we miss that opportunity.
China now is having a tremendous operation in terms of green development. It's also been very much advocating high quality growth. You hear that not only as a political slogan, but rather really it is getting into the, the brains of everybody. So how do you see this massive higher quality growth campaign in China likely to move this country to, and the Chinese economy overall?
The working age population is now declining and will continue to do so for the next several decades, irrespective of what you can do to encourage young women to have children. And that puts the pressure on productivity to offset it. Total factor productivity in China has been declining since 2011 at a 1.4% average annual rate. And if there's one thing you need to do to boost the quality of growth, it's to turn productivity around. And that's going to be a big challenge. There's a lot of sloganeering talking about new technology and innovation, but the trend, especially the focus on deriving economic growth in China from relatively low productivity state-owned enterprises, moving away from the higher productivity private enterprises, is particularly worrisome, and that needs to be addressed forcefully. Your leadership is talking about renewed emphasis on higher productivity private sectors, but again, that right now appears to be more of a slogan than a reality.
Finally, before we go, Professor, China has put forward to the rest of the world its annual growth rate will be around 5%. Now, how do you see the challenges and opportunities behind this number?
I think 5% is easily achievable following last year's extraordinarily subpar growth performance in China. It's what I tell my students, it's like a rubber band. You stretch a rubber band out, you pull it down, as was the case in China in 2022. When you release the rubber band, it snaps back. This is a year of a strong snapback. The questions that I am raising is, what happens after the snapback? I am worried much more about the outlook for 2024 and 2025 than I am about 2023. You will have no trouble achieving the growth target this year. The question is, what comes next?
What do you think should come next?
Well, I go back to my emphasis on productivity and boosting productivity through the combination of innovation and shifting back to a more dynamic private sector of the Chinese economy. That has, the government is talking about it, but we want to see concrete proposals that give us confidence that that is truly going to happen.
Professor, always a pleasure.
Great to talk to you.
Thank you so much.
Especially in person again.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
My interview with Stephen Roach from Yale University. That's all we have for today. You can find us on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of team. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you back here tomorrow.